Welcome to Tech News Briefing. It's Friday, December 8th. I'm Alex Ossola for the Wall Street Journal. If you have an iPhone, chances are it was made in China. There, Apple has a vast network of suppliers it uses to manufacture its phones. Now, though, the company is planning a big change. More iPhone production may head to India. Apple and its suppliers aim to build more than 50 million iPhones in India annually within the next 2 to 3 years. Wall Street Journal South Asia Bureau Chief Tripti Lahiri is here to tell us why Apple is making the shift. So historically, Apple has manufactured its iPhones in China. What exactly is changing now?
So Apple is trying to move more of its production out of China and into other places. And one of those places is India. It's also a big country. It's trying to add a lot of manufacturing jobs. And Apple has steadily moved more of its production to India and is planning to move a lot more in coming years.
And is it just Apple or is it also its suppliers that are making the shift?
So basically, when Apple makes that shift, it requires a whole ecosystem to move along with it. Apple's biggest suppliers, you might have heard of the name of Foxconn, that makes millions and millions of iPhones. So they are spearheading this production shift for Apple by setting up these mega plants in different parts of India.
What was appealing to Apple about making its iPhones in China in the first place?
It was just such a cost-effective way to do business. And people have said over and over again, there are a few places that could do what China did, which is manufacture lots and lots of things pretty well at a good cost and very efficiently.
When we talk about Apple and its suppliers shifting to India, what exactly is shifting?
So basically, we're talking about just these millions and millions of iPhones, let's say more than 200 million in any given year. A significant portion of those will not be made in China anymore. They will be made in India, and they won't be made just in India. And this is kind of important for India as well as for Apple. They won't just be made for Indian consumers. They will be shipped from factories in India to places around the world. So kind of mimicking what China has done for years. India is making about 15% of all of Apple's iPhones right now, but analysts who closely follow the company expect that to be 25% by 2025 and maybe go up even beyond that.
Why is Apple looking to make this shift, particularly now?
So the pandemic highlighted a lot of issues of having your supply chain too heavily concentrated in one place. And when China had really strict COVID rules, then things just seized up. And in addition, because those rules were so strict, there were sort of rare labor unrest in China in some of the biggest iPhone plants where workers just left or there was just a lot of disruption. And it really set back Apple's production. And at that time, they didn't have necessarily the ability to say, okay, we're just going to really ramp up at this plant in X place because they didn't at that time have plants of an equivalent scale really elsewhere.
For all the different places that Apple could have shifted part of its supply chain, why is it shifting to India?
India has a lot of potential. It has lots and lots of people who can both work in its factories, but maybe one day some of them will also buy those phones. That's not the case right now. Apple is a very niche and expensive product for most Indians. But certainly people here say that people are buying their first or their second smartphones, and eventually they will look at maybe owning an Apple iPhone. And in fact, Apple even opened its first Apple-owned store just this year.
And for Apple, what are some of the potential disadvantages of operating more heavily out of India?
The reason that India hasn't, up until now, been a big competitor or an alternative site for Apple is that for all these years, when Apple didn't have concerns about being in China, there wasn't really a good reason to be in India because it was always viewed as being more difficult. The infrastructure wasn't as good. The labor force isn't as educated. There's lots of red tape. And just starting up a factory and getting stuff made was always going to be more of a delayed and more of a difficult and clunky process in India.
From a consumer perspective, what could this change about how we around the world get our iPhones?
It's hard to tell right now because the shift to India, despite India having, let's say, lower labor costs than China, it's unclear that the overall process of making the iPhone is getting any cheaper. And in fact, there are ways in which there might be some higher costs out of operating in India. So at this point, it's unclear as to what it means for somebody who's buying an iPhone in the US. But it might mean that at least down the line, when there's a disruption in one place, Apple will just shift to one of its other factories in Asia and make up the difference.
That was our South Asia Bureau Chief, Tripti Lahiri. And that's it for Tech News Briefing. Today's show was produced by Julie Chang. I'm your host, Alex Ossola. Our supervising producer is Catherine Millsop. Our development producer is Aisha Al-Muslim. Scott Salloway and Chris Sinsley are the deputy editors. And Philana Patterson is the Wall Street Journal's head of news audio. Thanks for listening.